Welcome, everybody, and thank you. We're very grateful to you for joining us here tonight and for being part of our community. My name is Elric. I'm a board member of the Jung Association of Western Massachusetts. Tonight we have with us, we're going to have a lecture tonight entitled First Responders, the Paradox of Resilience and Vulnerability. Our speaker tonight is Benjamin Dennis, who is a mythologist and writer cultivating a lifelong love of story, myth, and psychology. He has been passionately involved in ritual, rites of passage, psychodrama, and storytelling. He is a U.S. Air Force veteran, a retired Seattle firefighter, and a former member of the Critical Incident Stress Management and Peer Support Team. He teaches at the Minnesota Men's Conference. He leads retreats for veterans and first responders and has been adjunct faculty at Antioch University in Seattle. Ben holds a PhD in mythological studies with an emphasis on depth psychology from Pacifica Graduate Institute. I also have a little bit more to add to that because Dr. Ed Tick, who is on our advisory board, sent me a little testimonial, and I'd like to just read that to you. Dr. Tick says that I have known and worked with Ben for many years and in many venues. Ben is a military veteran, a firefighter, and a leader of veterans, a student of Robert Bly, and a men's movement leader himself, leader and facilitator of the Minnesota Men's Conference. He has a PhD in transpersonal psychology and is a storyteller and myth teacher. On retreats together, he has been our myth teller and our teacher and our keeper of the sacred altar. Ben is deep, sincere, passionate, strong, wise, kind, devoted, and mystical. Ed goes on to say that he regrets that he can't be here tonight. And now, without further ado, please welcome Benjamin Dennis.
Hello, everybody. First off, gratitude to Ed for that lovely introduction. Although I don't have a PhD in transpersonal psychology, it is mythological studies. It's always good to know that I'm seen and recognized by somebody as esteemed as Ed. Thanks to everybody else for being here. So the talk tonight, vulnerability and resilience, the paradox. After spending all the years that I did in uniform, I was military veteran, 4 years in the Air Force in my 20s. And then after a short hiatus, I became a firefighter in 1993. Spent 28 years in the fire department. And what I can say is that there's a lot of stories. As I was thinking about this subject, I recognized that one of the struggles that we have when we're working around the population or the public in uniform is that there's a gulf between us, between the people that we serve and us. It's based on the uniform. And early on in my career, I was on a ladder truck. And the ladder truck, if anybody's seen a ladder truck, it's got the big long ladder and the guy standing on the back. And everywhere we go, I'd see kids running out there to wave, and people would wave. And it dawned on me once that what they were waving at was the uniform. Of course, when I saw myself, I recognize, see myself in the glass of the stores and stuff, it was me, but people were recognizing the uniform, and that's what they were watching. So what I realized is that as I look back over the course of my life and the stories that came out, what were the stories that I was stuck with? And they were the ones that were paradoxical, that were odd, ones where I was uncertain, and where I felt just simply strange. They were the ones that stuck out. and I realized that over the years, I've got a lot of stories. People have died while I perform CPR, and then I'll dream about them. I remember once being on the roof of a burning building and looking over the edge. I mean, there's flames behind me that are 20 feet tall coming out of the center of this building that I'm standing on 5 stories up. And I look down and I see all the chiefs, high-fiving each other that the fire was out. So I take a handful of gravel off the rooftop and I throw it down and it comes bouncing around. The chiefs all look up and I'm like, fire up here, and then everybody starts scrambling. I remember one time trying to get a bird. A bird had gotten itself trapped in the chase. You know how they have the chimneys on the side of a building that are surrounded by wood and the chimneys on the inside. Well, there's a bird inside one, and we tried everything we could, and we could not get that bird out. And with a great deal of grief, we had to leave that bird. And then it wasn't more than 2 weeks later that there was a cat in a similar situation in a different house. And we were able to get the cat out. And then I remember there was another time where I went rushing back to the station after a call. My girlfriend at the time was coming for lunch. When I got back to the station, I had to run desperately to the bathroom, hoping that she wouldn't arrive because I had to wash blood off my hands and arms. And it was kind of exciting, but it was really, really strange. There was another time, Christmas Eve, just down the street from the fire station. We went down and a man had a heart attack. And we spent an hour doing CPR on this man underneath the Christmas tree, pushing the presents out of the way, working on him, hoping to try to get him back while his family watched. He didn't make it. He died with my hands on his chest. And then on the way back, there's kids on the side of the road waving. And when we got back to the fire station, there were cookies and cards for Christmas from the local school. And then there's always the ubiquitous, the thing that happens all the time wherever you go and you're recognized, the thank you for your service, which is really wonderful. So what I want to say is that first responders interact with us larger society, and we put ourselves intentionally directly in the path of insurmountable pain, anguish, and we tend to acute needs. And the people that I work with, to a person, man, woman, they are exceptional, amazing human beings. But they're people, they're human beings. And we all have our problems. For this talk, I don't have any PowerPoints. I don't have any, Venn diagrams. I'm not looking to try to lay out a whole bunch of statistics, because any one of us who's interested in this field can go out there on the internet and there's countless resources, articles, information. But I really want to try to talk more about what it's really like, some of the things that I've gone through and the observations that I've made. I realized that as much as we can talk about all of these circumstances that, the researches and the studies and stuff, it doesn't really matter unless we're willing to engage with each other on a personal level. But there is one thing I do want to know, and this is something that's only begun. It shifted, I think, in 2017 or 18, where suicide became one of the leading causes of on-duty death for firefighters in particular, significantly higher than police, surprisingly. And the understanding that one research article that I read suggests that up to 40% of firefighter suicides is not reported. So it could be even higher. So that puts suicide in one of the top 3 leading causes of death, on-duty death for firefighters. And that's next to cancer and heart disease. Which if you want to take a look at things from a more mystical, Ed brought up the mystical side, heart disease and cancer can also be viewed as afflictions of the soul. We want to go down that road, which I tend to. And the other thing is that it's only been recently, I think, in the last 10, 12 years, where you're starting to find more and more research on cumulative effects, the cumulative effect of events leading to PTSD. We just passed legislation here in Washington where PTSD is considered an on-the-job illness that the state is required under its labor and industries laws to affect some kind of support for, and that was just passed here a few years ago. So there's a big change, and society is changing. Divorce rates are high, depression is high, alcoholism. These are all other forms of addiction. These are all part of the field that we live in. But really what I want to do is get more down to the stories, get more down to the specifics. Because what I realize that what we do is we throw ourselves into the fire, whether you're police, fire, EMS, we throw ourselves into dangerous situations. And to do that, well, we'll backtrack a little bit. One of my close friends, Miguel, knows Roger Shords, and he spoke about veterans in particular, what their tasks were. And I won't go into that part, but what it did is made me take a reflective look at what my task was. As a firefighter in particular, I was tasked with being willing to sacrifice my life for others. In 1995, we lost 4 firefighters. There was a collapse in a building that was burning, and it took 4 of us with it. And I happened to be out on an injury. I'd hurt my back not that long before. And I went to dinner with some friends in the city. And I was standing outside before we went in dinner, and I could smell smoke. And I wonder what's going on. We sat down to dinner. We had just eaten the appetizers. I remember clearly I had a salad in front of me, and my phone started to ring. It was back in the day when we first got cell phones. And it was people asking me if I was okay. And it was one of the most trying experiences that I had. I was new in the fire department. I was still getting my, orientation. It's surprising. It takes a while. I was a year and a half in, and I was off on disability. My back hurt. And here there were 4 firefighters that were lost in a collapsed building. And so I had to find something inside myself to move forward. And when I got back to work, I remember sitting in the office. This was on Capitol Hill in downtown Seattle. And I remember thinking, at that point, we went and saw a lot of homeless people, and a lot of, it was a lot of drugs, alcohol, that sort of thing. And I remember thinking very clearly that with the challenges that I'd had just in the year and a half that I'd been working, I really wanted to look at what it was that I was doing and the commitment that I made. And so I made a very conscious choice that I was going to do this work with an open heart. And to the best of my ability, that's what I did. However, the task that demanded of me was to allow myself a measure of vulnerability. And it was challenging. One of the things that occurred to me was that the work that we did expects us to move into the world with compassion, be able to embrace the vulnerability in ourselves and others, and to really hold on to the truth that when I show up with a high function, with the functioning of what my suffering metric is, if you will, it's not the same as others' metric. It's not the same as what other people go through. They have their own thing. Somebody can show up with a hangnail, and that can be that's as much as they can handle. My job isn't to show up to judge. My job is to show up and treat them well. And so this brings me to this dilemma, this paradox: how to stay open and available enough so that I can truly belong. And this is where I come to the crux of what I think a lot of us struggle with. And that's the isolation. I look at isolation as one of the great afflictions of this work that we do. And if we are to find ourselves a way to answer that affliction, we need to find out a way of how to belong. And so this is where I come with the idea of stories, the invitation for us each to find, tell, and hear the stories. I say hear, not listen, because I'm really encouraging the idea that when a story is being told, if we allow ourselves to enter into its story, we can find something powerful for each of us. Beginning of the classes that I teach, when I was at Antioch, I wrote up on the board, I can't imagine. You can raise your hand. How many people have heard somebody say, I can't imagine? My assertion is this: that's absolutely and utterly not true. We can imagine, and all of us do imagine. We may not want to imagine. What our imaginations might be may or may not be accurate to the circumstance, but we can imagine. And that's what we need to touch in on. And so that's what the invitation is: the stories. How do I live into the stories that I tell? How do I engage with the community so that they can participate? Because if we can, everybody comes together and brings the gifts that they have, that's the participation that we have to bring healing to our community. So what are the stories? The paradoxes, my lived experience, the stories of being one who responds when no one else will. Running into burning, one interesting thing, run into burning building one day and being terrified to ask a girl out on a date the next day. That kind of a paradox. Sitting quietly in a kitchen while my crew verifies that a man is actually dead in the other room, having killed himself, and noticing the beautifully tended lawn out front, and the spotless house, and the paperwork sitting on the kitchen table, waiting, knowing that this man wanted all of his affairs in order before he left this world. I've seen cookies, I mentioned before, handmade greeting cards, conversations during blood pressure checks when the people come into the fire station. I've seen hope in eyes, grief in faces, shock, wonder. And then I want, the stories of the people that I worked with, the stories of the folks, we get folks come to the fire station to thank you for saving my life. And then, within our group, stories of passion, prejudice, talk about political discussions over the kitchen table, religious discussions, social discussions, culture discussions. Well, passion, prejudice, love, hate. There's childhood trauma. There's ongoing trauma, divorces, children struggling, fatigue so deep there doesn't seem to be enough rest in the world. And then the conundrum of when the bell hits and the adrenaline strikes, we go running. We throw ourselves into the fires, we throw ourselves into the unknown, we throw ourselves into pain, suffering. And then twice a week, 3 times a week, we go home, we mow the lawn, play with the kids, and in a few days, we do it all again. I've remembered blood, broken bones, pain, suffering, damage to life, limb, property. And I was one of the ones that did something about that as best as I could. So when I was a young firefighter, this was something that was really important to me. I reveled in it. I mean, the excitement of showing up to work, ready to run into a building, ready to try to save somebody's life, even in the middle of the night, tending to somebody that was, had drank too much and was sitting in a doorway. It was exciting. I mean, granted, it was tiring at times and there was horrifying experiences, but I loved what I was doing. It had meaning, purpose. And one of the most powerful and loving things that I could that I could possibly imagine doing in my life. But then after years, it started maybe, I've been retired now for 2 years. I retired April 1st, 2 years ago, April Fool's Day. About 5 years ago, so maybe 3 years beforehand, I realized that I was starting to get tired. And the bell, when the alarm went off, I was no longer excited. Granted, if there was smoke in the air and we knew that there was something exciting to go on, that I was racing at ridiculous speeds in a fire engine with three other guys, and everybody's all excited to get something. But I realized that I was starting to see more of myself. And as much as I had made the decision to do this work with an open heart, I realized that I was armored, shut down and emotionally, and didn't realize how much pain I was causing those who were around me, the people that I cared about. And when I finally recognized that, I knew that I still loved the job. I still loved what I was doing, but it was time to leave. And so I retired. And when I retired, things changed. And so now, after 2 years, I'm reflecting on what this meant, knowing that my life, 28 years as a firefighter, is part of who I am, but it's not all of who I am. And this was an important distinction to make. And recognizing also that I was a storyteller and somebody that thought deeply about different things. And so this is where I come to the resilience and vulnerability and the stories that give meaning to the paradox of what that is all about. I think it's important to touch on this idea that, well, one friend of mine, one colleague, she noticed something. And we were at a retreat where there was both male and female police, fire, EMS, doing a critical incident stress management peer support retreat. And she noticed that when vulnerability arrived and strength at the same time, that it triggered people and caused some discomfort, and people would react. And so I started to notice more and more that as people were unable to allow some flexibility into their lives, the more rigid they became, and the harder it was, the more jaded they were about the work that they were doing. And it's good to note that this is a paradoxical role. We run into burning buildings. We are stopped in the middle of freeways. We rappel down the sides of cliffs. We jump in where people have been shot or terrible accidents, or just simple little things where somebody is suffering, and we do the best that we can. And compassion is a big part of it, but so is compassion fatigue. It's interesting. Jung, as I was doing my research, Jung noted this statement: paradox is one of the most valued spiritual possessions. And so in my notes, I jotted down, the role of every first responder as they address their own sense of being and weigh the necessities of the community. There is truly a mental, soulful, and spiritual path that they're invited to be on. And so if we look at these roles, these jobs in our community as merely jobs, I think we miss something really important. And this is where each of us had to figure out how to do adaptive practices, how to find a way to be part of a community in such a way that we didn't have to do this work alone. And it fell on each of us. One of the struggles that we had is so much support was given to the individual's effort to maintain mental health and maintain connection. So, you could find therapy, you could do an encounter group, you could do a retreat, if you had, substance things, you could go off and do a time at a rehab or something along those lines. Oftentimes people struggling with divorce, alcoholism, other issues, they were pretty much left alone. And what I realized is that the places where we were most successful, the individuals we were most successful, they were the ones that were able to access a larger community. And so herein lies the root, I think, of the paradox of the vulnerability and resilience. Each of us was demanded that we be armored, that we have what it takes to do the job. And yet when we look at the word vulnerable, It's interesting to look up the definition of the word vulnerable. Capable of being physically or emotionally wounded, open to attack or damage. The root from Latin to wound. The implication is that openness has its risks. The etymology of the word includes Valhalla. We all know that word from Northern Europe. And the word Valhalla, I didn't know this, but the word Valhalla means the wound hall. And the Valhalla was where the Valkyries would take the warriors, the mythic warriors, after they had done their thing. So this was something that created openness. And when I looked at synonyms, the synonym of vulnerable is endangered, exposed, liable, open, sensitive, susceptible, unguarded, undefended. Now, that can be a little bit frightening to somebody that throws themselves into the teeth of the fire on a regular basis. But when you look at the antonyms, which I think is even more important, the opposite of vulnerable is this: invulnerable, protected, covered, screened, guarded, resistant, armored, impenetrable. And here's where it gets interesting: unconquerable, omnipotent, and almighty. Can we see the trajectory there of what it means to not be vulnerable? How many of us have had friends or relationships with someone that embodies the opposite of vulnerability, and how damaging that can be? And so what I was suggesting is that on one side of this paradox, that this is a necessity of our job, is the willingness to be open and allow the world to touch our souls in some way that we can then be open and accessible to the people that we're in service to. And the potential of the risk, of course, or the potential of danger is very high. And I found myself even doing this intentionally, of being exactly some of those other things: armored and impenetrable, guarded, resistant. These were all part of what I had to contend with in my own relationships. The other side of the paradox is the word resilience. And that's an interesting word. Resilience, the definition is capable of withstanding shock without permanent deformation or rupture, tending to recover from or adjust easily to misfortune or change. Now, the word resilience has both mechanical or engineering applications, and it has psychological applications. It's only been about 50 years, and maybe a little bit more than that now, that resilience was used in psychological terms, and primarily with children who had experienced a great deal of trauma in their lives, and how psychologists noticed that some children survived those experiences with little to no affect as adults. They were considered resilient. Now, the synonyms, again, I like words: flexible, plastic, elastic, adaptable, stretchable, supple, malleable, ductile, moldable, and I love these last two: limber and lithe. Now, that to me evokes something truly creative and powerful and beautiful. This idea that being resilient is beautiful. Now, I'm going to argue that there's a deep connection between these things of vulnerability and resilience. And when you go further and you look at the root of resilience and some of the other applications, you look at the antonyms, for example: rigid, inflexible, and stiff. And how close those antonyms match the antonyms to vulnerability. So armor, we've got images of armor. We've got tanks, we've got knights in shining armor clinking down the hall, and in a certain degree, mechanically, police, fire, EMS each have their own armor necessary to do the job. But if we don't take that armor, if we allow that armor to become the metaphorical cladding that we wrap around our souls, as well as to run into burning buildings and confront danger, then I think we're in trouble. And so, while these definitions aren't fixed, I think it's important to really understand that there's a deep connection between these things and start bringing them back together again. The next thing I want to talk about is culture. When you're confronted with what it means to be open, connected, available, and the realization that my friend Dr. McMorrow noticed that this is triggering to people, and recognizing that the culture, the heroic culture, doesn't really afford room for the vulnerability that's exposed. It's like we've all seen pictures of the firefighter holding, a baby that he just pulled out of a fire, or how tenderly they treat a kitten, or maybe the tears in the eyes. I mean, anybody that looked closely at 9/11 could see the tears in the eyes of the first responders, the firefighters, and the people there trying to effect rescue in this horrendous situation. Can see the incredible vulnerability. Ed Tick tells a story of a one of the New York firefighter chiefs that was at the Twin Towers. And when he arrived home, finally, after the days of being in that horrific mess, covered head to toe with the dirt, there was his wife standing at the door with a bucket of water and soap and the hose. And she made him strip down naked and wash outside in the yard. Brings tears to my eyes to think about that. Because right there is a relationship that was able to embrace the paradox of being vulnerable, of being stripped naked in your front yard, not even allowed into the house until you washed all of that off. The amount of vulnerability that chief, that firefighter, experienced in his front yard is astounding. But the connection that he had with his wife, and I would argue with the larger community, allowed him the strength and fortitude to be able to live through that experience. One of the things that we also have to consider in the culture is that when we show up, and this is a well-known thing that amongst us firefighters, is that when we show up with resources, training, capacity, ability, capability, in excess, hopefully, of those that are calling on us. And when we show up, depending on what we find, sometimes it's, pell-mell, jump off the rig, throw your mask on your face, yard some hose off the back of the fire engine and go running into a burning building. Hoorah. I mean, that's what we live for. Or it might be jumping off the fire engine and seeing, an older gentleman who had fallen off the roof trying to clean his gutters, or a young woman who's struggling with a mental health breakdown, or a child who's broken something in a fall, crashed his bicycle, taken a baseball to the head, and we've had a few of those. And when those instances, we have to show up. I mean, I remember one time, one of the guys that I worked with, a gentleman named Don, 6'4" tall. He had shoulders that would put Arnold Schwarzenegger to shame. He looked like he should have a horned helmet on. He had, big, the big one eyebrow, big nose, just muscles, solid as a rock, and glowering. He glowered everywhere he went. Even his smile was a glower. And two things happened one day when I was working. One, we went to a call where a woman had fallen. And she banged her head, she'd broken her nose, and she was pretty distraught. And there's Don, all 6'4", 275 pounds of muscle, on his knees, gently holding her hand and whispering to her that everything would be okay. I almost had to reach up and close my jaw because my mouth was hanging out at the unbelievable amount of gentleness that came out of this man. Later on that night, you'll have to excuse my French here on this next part of the story. I'm with Don. We're 3 o'clock in the morning. Both of us are wide awake from calls, so we start to watching TV. We catch the end of a movie, and it was one of those sappy movies. And there's Don sitting there, and he just, you have to imagine that, I think I've got the face right. And then he just kind of shakes his head at the end of the movie and says, "That's the saddest fucking movie I've ever seen in my life." And he gets up and walks away and goes, hits a rack. And once again, I was standing there with my mouth open, just, not really understanding this. So the dilemma that I could see is how to retain fortitude, resilience, you through vulnerability in a job that demands a tremendous amount from us, up to and including our lives. I've lost, I think it's 4 friends to suicide. At least 4 friends, the people guys that I knew that went in and at the beginning of my career to actual death in the fire, and probably a minimum of a dozen or more to various illnesses from heart attack and cancer and so on. We put our all on the line. But one of the things that I recognize that our capacity to have each other's back is really the most crucial aspect. Because when we are able to retain the fortitude necessary, the resilience necessary, we also recognize that we have to give it all away. The vulnerable aspect that we have, the capacity to be open is what's called for. And one of the ways that I've seen to do this is through story. And this is where I want to bring all of this, is that when we have the capacity, we'll back up a little bit. One of the things that I noticed, the idea that driving by in the fire engine and people are waving at the uniform, the idea that, or the experience of walking into a coffee shop and having people say, "Hey, thank you for your service," and all the rest of it. I found myself struggling with that little bit of a gap. And what I realized I had one experience where I was at Starbucks up in Seattle here, with a couple of the guys from my crew who were in uniform, standing in line to get our coffees. And gentleman standing next to me said, "Thank you for your service." And I said, "Thank you, appreciate that." And then he grabbed my eye and he kept looking at me, and he just looked at me and he said, "So how is it with you?" And when he did that, it was with such genuine curiosity, it startled me. And what I recognized for that moment was that all of the times that people said, "Thank you for your service," I was struck by both the acknowledgement and the profound blessing to be noticed, in our communities, and the discomfort. I noticed the discomfort with people not knowing what else to say and being afraid to ask a further question. I didn't need to share with that man any story. I could say to him, "Hey, things are great. Thank you for asking." That could have been the end of it. Or I could have sat down and had a cup of coffee and shared some stories with him. The important part was the invitation to open myself up, be heard, have somebody curious about that. The other side of this, the paradoxical side again, is that when we put these pieces of memory, these stories deep inside of us, and we don't share them, then a piece of our soul will live off of that story for who knows how long. I recognize this because of some of the things that I carried. There was a story where walked into a house, the woman in the house said, "My roommate, something's wrong with her." We were running into the room, and she was laying there. I checked the pulse; she was dead. I kind of felt her, and I said, "Okay, that's it. She's done." My partner comes running in and looked at me, and he said, "Are you sure?" And I insisted, and I said, "No, she's gone. We can call it." And we left, and then the doubts started to come up. Did I make the right decision? Could have we have done CPR on this woman and maybe saved her life? I don't think so, but a part of me still wonders. So I have to hold that. And that piece has chewed on my soul for a long time and still until I started sharing it. Stories are how we carry and speak to our experiences. There's a great video. Tacoma Fire Department here south of Seattle did a great video. And the title of the video, and I would recommend that you watch it, is The Call We Carry. And in that video, they talk about these experiences and share the stories. And so what I realized in this paradox of trying to be open and trying to also be resilient, the answer is to be inclusive of the community. Every member of the community has a place in that community. It's not about accommodating. It's not about fixing yourself so that you can be a nice, a nice member. No, what's called for is the capacity to belong, and belonging is one of the ways that you can address the pain and suffering that we put ourselves through, and by extension, the pain and suffering of the individuals that we are in service to. Then that load is carried by the entire community. And that brings us finally to this notion of access. When I tell my stories, now whether I'm telling a mythological tale, the devil's sooty brother out of Grimm's fairy tales, or the ball carrier from the Menominee people in Minnesota, the metaphors that come through those mythological tales speak to all of our experiences and open up the door for my lived experience and the stories that I have to tell. And so when we do that, when we're able to tell our stories, when I'm able to share my experiences and have you, the community, engage your imaginations, whether or not those imaginations are accurate or not, doesn't matter. But when we collectively engage in the images that these stories bring up, then we all help carry the load. The load doesn't get dumped on us. As there is an old saying in the fire service, it's like many hands makes light work. And what I would argue is that confronting this paradox of vulnerability and resilience is many ears lighten the load that we who are at the front lines carry. Many hearts help carry the weight that I carry. So, and this brings us back to this idea that when we allow the stories of pain, suffering, success, beauty, when we allow those things into the room, we are bringing about a sense of belonging and generosity and connection that will ultimately serve all of us. And then ultimately, I think, in the big picture, it feeds the resilience of the community as a whole. Michael Mead up here talks about, he did mosaic voices. And I love the image of a mosaic, because a mosaic is built up of broken pieces that are brought back together in an image of tremendous beauty. So anybody that's looking very closely at a mosaic can see all the little pieces that are glued together again. And when you stand back, you recognize that each unique piece has a place in the larger picture. And that's what I'm hoping that we can encourage, and that we can work with, at the very least, to keep the general populations connected, especially in this day and age where there's so much division and so much polarization. How we can connect with the stories is really important. And the final thing that I want to talk about is grief. My friend Paola here, she said something really profound and kind of knocked my socks off a little bit. Grief will not tear you apart, but it will break you open. And to be open invites life to flourish. But ultimately, I've said ultimately about 25 times now, I think in the end, John Becknell, who some of you might know, he talks about living fully, living better, having a connected life that's engaged with the larger community. That's where I'm trying to bring us with this talk, is that when we are more attentive to the stories that are being told, more attentive to the place that each of us carries within us and how that's shared in a larger community, the more generous, receptive, and engaged we are, and the more healing of a relationship we can have with all of the members of our community. And just maybe down the road, maybe we can start addressing some of these insurmountable issues. Thank you. That's what I have to say so far. I'm going to invite you to mull over some of what I said, and then let's have some discussion and see what we come up with. So take a minute and throw your hand up if you have anything to say. And I think let's see, Andrew noticed that if you go down to the reactions tab at the bottom, you can click on that and then stick a hand up, and we'll start having some voices in the room. And if you want, I can share some more stories. But let me share one before we go any further. Talking about some of the cultural wars, I remember it was late 90s, and there was a fire in one of the local universities in the lab building. And I walked in with my crew, and I had both hands full of tools and fire extinguishers and all that kind of stuff, and walked into the hallway. So it was like, I think it was the second floor or third floor. We went up the stairs out the back, walked in, and it was completely floor to ceiling smoke. What most people don't realize, that firefighters do a big chunk of their firefighting in pitch black. The smoke gets rid of all vision, except for the little bit of a glow you might see. And so standard practice is to go in with one hand on a wall, and so you can track where you are. Well, I'd walked in, both hands full of tools with my crew. Somehow or another got turned around, and I stopped and realized I didn't know where I was. The hallway was maybe 20 feet wide, university hallways. And when I looked up, I could see fingers of flames going across the smoke above me. And I could feel it starting in my toes, working up my body, into my crotch, into my lower belly, into my middle belly, up to my rib cage, until it reached about, my heart level. And I could feel my breathing getting shallower and shallower and shallower. And I noticed off to one side, there was a classroom door. With university school classrooms, they have that tall, skinny window that, maybe 4 inches wide and a couple feet tall. And there was light on the other side of the window. And I could feel my consciousness stepping behind my body and watching my body with this reach out, grab the doorknob, turn the doorknob. It's locked. Scratch at the window. I mean, I'm not joking here. This is what I was doing. I was scratching at the window, trying the doorknob, scratching at the window, trying the doorknob, scratching at the window, trying the doorknob. And my mind is saying, geez, Ben, you better get yourself out of there, because you won't make it out alive if you don't do something. Scratching at the window, trying the doorknob. My body I was completely dissociated in that moment out of the terror of being in a burning building and not knowing where I was. After a minute, one of my compatriots found me, one of my fellow firefighters found me and says, "Oh, there you are," reached out, grabbed me by the sleeve, and led me out to the hallway or the top of the stairs. I walked in, I mean, he held my hand out of the fire. I walked into the landing of the staircase. There's the rest of my crew. And this is what I did. I went, picked up my tools, turned around, went right back in and fought fire. Back at the fire station, I started sharing with the guys because I realized this was an embodied experience that I now had that I wanted to share. And so I'm in the what we call it the beanery. The kitchen in a fire station is called a beanery. It's where we cook our beans. I'm in the beanery and I'm sharing what I just shared with you. And the old guys were all going, just kind of listening and just, nodding their heads. A couple of the young guys, they're just like, you're full of whatever. It's like, that never happened to me. And off we went. So the culture doesn't allow, at least on the surface, that acknowledgement of the depth and breadth of experience that includes something as devastating as being so afraid that you're unable to even walk yourself out of a hallway. But by sharing that story, even though I was poo-pooed by some of the young guys, let off some of the energy of that and allowed me to carry on doing what I did, becoming, I'd like to think at least a fairly well-respected firefighter. So that's the last story I have. I can certainly tell more. Any questions? Christine?
The first, I have two parts. One, just something personal for me, and someone who couldn't be here tonight sent me a question to ask you. Okay. So that's the second part. But the first part is just, I'm not sure I can say it without crying, but I had not realized that it was a firefighter that saved my son's life by breaking down the door of his apartment and hauling him out after he had a grand mal seizure. It wasn't even on my screen that had happened. So I'm just honoring the fact that there was a person there who saved my son's life. And I hope in my honoring at this late date, it somehow completes a circle. I don't know, but I really appreciate your just bringing this to my awareness, to my consciousness.
Thank you for sharing that. That's a really important thing for all of us to hear. It's wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah. I mean, it makes sense. Our family was in a big crisis, but still there was that person who came. So.
And you had a second part?
Yes, this is from those of you here who know Jonathan Capra, who works with our organization. He says that he was in an ambulance in a serious medical emergency, and the EMTs in the ambulance were making small talk and chatting, and it was disturbing to him. But much later, he realized that was probably part of their survival, mode, that they needed to somehow keep their attention out and not be focusing so much on him. So he was wondering if you agree that behavior on their part helped them do their job properly.
That's absolutely true. It's referred to oftentimes as things like gallows humor and that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. Typically, we try to be a little bit more circumspect around people. The difficulty is that a lot of times what's happening for the person, if you're in the back of an ambulance, it's everything in the whole world. That little space, that little cot, it's your whole world. And for us, unfortunately, we do it all the time. But the important part here is to recognize that when we are experiencing on a regular basis that much trauma, we need to bleed off the energy some. And one of the ways we do that, is a little bit, is the chit chat. Hey, how's it going? I'm going to meet, you guys want to get together for, a beer and a cigar later. And, okay, the kids have got a game and that kind of thing. Is like everyday life. It's not ever meant as a disrespect to you, the person that's experiencing the emergency, but it's always about part of a larger community. So even though it's disturbing, and I acknowledge this, and we talk about it on a regular basis with each other, it still happens. The hardest ones are when somebody overhears the more extreme kind of humor, from, say, you're in the apparatus bay next to the fire engine, and guys are cracking jokes, and it can get really, sometimes it can get pretty disturbing if you're not part of that cycle, or that circle. It really is psychologically a way of bleeding off the energy, of coming to terms with the immensity of what we experience and trying to normalize it for us. Because if we don't if we don't allow it to normalize, and we're horrified at every time that something happens, like the story that I had of running in with blood all over my hands and arms. It's like, how many people here outside of a surgeon or whatever has those experiences? I mean, it can be devastating. So it's never meant as a disrespect for the person or the people that are suffering. It's always as part of our way of adapting.
And he came to understand that it was, necessary. And he just wanted you to comment about that. And thank you.
Well, one thing I would encourage him, if it still weighs on him, is to actually you don't need to go confront the firefighters, but go where they are, try to find out who they are. Same thing with you who saved your son. Just go take a card and say, hey, I want to say thank you for that, and have a conversation with them, and you'll be able to see the humanity in their eyes. That's one of the things, is if you can connect with these guys, even after something as like this, you'll be, I think you'll be pleasantly surprised at how much humanity shows up. Andrew, you had a question?
Yeah, Ben, thank you for this. My question comes out of a personal interest, a concern for my brother, who has been a first responder for more than 20 years. He started as an EMT. He's a paramedic now. And I just wonder about, accumulated exposure, what might be called secondary trauma. And he's very kind of self-contained. I don't hear a lot about what he experiences. And I wonder, well, and there's a parallel, which is working with Ed Tick. I've learned the importance of helping the community, helping people return from war and to deal with the war trauma. So what role, if any, does the community have in helping first responders to integrate their trauma experience?
I think that's a really good question. Thank you for asking that, because I think it's really important. I think hopefully I touched on that some in the talk, but the capacity to go beyond the thank you for your service. And it doesn't have to be, there's not an expectation that somebody tell their story, but if you can get people to talk at least some, or at least know that they were invited to speak, that goes a long way towards helping them unburden themselves. Like I said before, it's like a lot of times there are memories that aren't even conscious, but they weigh on us. It's like I said before, the soul feeds on those memories if they're not metabolized. This is one of the things that Miguel here talks about, is metabolizing, unmetabolized grief, unmetabolized trauma weighs on us. And oftentimes in ways that are we don't even realize. I know I certainly did, and relationships and friendships suffered because I didn't realize, how guarded I was and how defensive I was. So what I would suggest with, it's your brother, you said?
Yeah.
Every time you see him, when you get a chance, invite him to open up. Hey, tell me how things are. You don't have to ask him to tell you the latest bloody story or anything like that, but give him room intentionally to share. And this is what I think you'll find. When you open the door and allow somebody to begin telling their stories, first off, you're not going to get anything.
Yeah.
I'll tell each and every one of you that when you open the door to allow somebody to tell their story, especially from a group like this, veterans or first responders, at first you're not going to get anything. Hey, everything's great. Love my job. Guys are great. Good work. End of story. Keep listening. Keep the door open. And pretty soon you're going to go, yeah, well, there was this one time. Keep the door open. The more you're able to keep the door open and the more you're able to hear and allow those images, those stories to flow, not only from the person to you, but through you, then the more that they're going to be able to unburden themselves. And we call it, look at the language. We say unburden when somebody is carrying a heavy weight through a traumatic experience. And so the reason we say unburden yourself is because it is a burden. And the cumulative and collective experience of first responder, paramedics especially, because they're on the cusp of life and death every single day that they go to work. That when those things, start weighing on them, it's really, really tough. And the emotions and your soulful connection to your friends and family, that's what begins to suffer. That's where you're going to see the break. Mm. The next thing I would suggest is that with any of these people, do the best you can to encourage them to get out in nature. Mm. It's amazing what the beauty of nature will do to balm the soul. Whether it's gardening, hiking, bike riding, taking a walk, you could take a walk with your brother or whoever, if there's an opening. Allow the stories to come in and allow them to be in the living world. We're here for a finite time. None of us is getting out of this alive, they say. But the more that you're able to engage the beauty of life, then the more opportunity they have to unburden themselves.
Thank you.
Judy?
Thank you, Ben. Personally, what's happened for me tonight is a recognition of the truth of what you're saying about strength and vulnerability and the lie in the culture that you can't have those two together. And someone in your with your life experience and your work in the men's movement, I want to say that for me, you're talking to what you have to say is about humans in our culture, because I'm not in the field that you're in. I'm not an emergency worker. I have a neighbor and friends and who are, but I have been taught in my life, and I'm I'm female bodied and I cry, and I'm supposedly I have more access to my vulnerability, supposedly, and it isn't really true. And listening to you, it feels like you're at an edge in the culture. You're speaking to a lie in the culture, and I just really, really appreciate it. And what you said about how listen to the stories, and many hearts, many ears carry the load. It's just true for it's true for all of us, but because of the people that you're talking about, and your personal experience, which is, I hope this isn't offensive, but is at an extreme. You're talking about people who we hold up as heroes, and heroes can't heroes can't be vulnerable. I mean, you said all this and it's so beautifully, and so I'm just saying I'm just repeating back what you said, but that when it's the people that you're talking about, and from, like I said, your personal experience, then it has this, for me personally, it has this ripple effect for all of us in our own lives. Like I'm just aware that being vulnerable is really hard, and when I'm supposed to be, when I'm feeling grief, or I'm feeling upset with the state of the world and mass extinction. I mean, I'm not going to go on and on, but I feel really sad. But then how can I help save the world if I'm sad? So anyway, and you gave us a medicine, a way to, just like you did with just Andrew just right now. You gave us a way to go forward, and I'm thank you. Just really grateful. Thank you.
Thank you, Judy. I'll just make a couple of observations real quick. Is that in our society we live a pretty heavily projected society. It's easy to project. So yes, I've carried the hero projection, and I've done all the rest of that. But it's when we are able to tell each other stories, listen to each other's stories, engage our imaginations with each other, then those immensities start breaking down. And that's one of the things that I think, I mean, climate change, national and international politics, wars in other parts of the world. I mean, these are huge things that individually we can't do anything about. However, collectively, through engaging with each other, through sharing, through touching out into the natural world, we can, for ourselves and our place in the world. And that ends up having profound effect out there in the world. I sincerely believe that. The last thing is that what I was talking about with this vulnerability and resilience, vulnerability, strength, it's, yes, I'm talking about first responders, but it's true for all of us. There isn't anything that I'm saying that doesn't apply to all of us. And when I think about storytelling and when we listen to stories, this is why I really want to encourage everybody to craft a practice of hearing and listening. Because when you can do that, it's amazing what comes out. Adam, you had something?
G'day, mate. I'm Adam. I'm a paramedic from Australia.
Welcome.
Thank you. I've just knocked off night shift, actually. So I wanted to ask you, just like a struggle of mine, and just like it kind of touches on what you speak to. Like, you're at work and you see these things, like you might have a real deep experience of someone dying and you're seeing it and the wife's there holding their hand, or it might be a really traumatic event or something. And then you come home, you've just experienced this thing, and then you come home and you've got to be normal for your family, or the differing spaces or the interchanging space of work and normal life. I just find really interesting, and moving in and out of those spaces can become very taxing and tolling. And I wanted your thoughts on that.
Well, it's interesting. What I didn't bring up earlier was the how sacred it is to share stories with each other. I mean, you're in Australia, so you have exposure to populations there that are profoundly attached to how they carry story. It's in the land, it's in the artwork, it's everywhere. But one of the things that very specifically in your situation, and I've talked with other firefighters and paramedics, is to, I invite you to, if you're married, I assume.
Yeah.
Yeah. So see if you can sit down and maybe a conversation with your wife or with a couple of friends where you have a few minutes when you get off shift and get home. Because, we worked 24-hour shifts. but when you get home and you have some time, is to be able to sit down with your wife or with one or two of your friends that are part of this your larger community, and tell them what happened so that they know where you are. And do it in a way, this is where I don't want to step too far out here, but I'll say this. Make it a ritual. And the way that I know to do that would be to do something like have a special place that you go. Hey, honey, got off work. A particularly tough time. Do you have a couple of minutes at the kitchen table or on the backyard or whatever? If you can, light a candle or do something else that commemorates that short time together and tell her what happened. Tell her what your day was like.
Yeah.
Tell her what came up. And then the next part, and this I think is really important, have a larger community than just your wife to help carry that load. And encourage the same thing for your wife. Because as much as we like, the two people carrying a load is better than one person, but two people still isn't enough. Grow your community.
Yeah.
Doesn't have to be big. You don't have to have 50 people out there hearing your stories. But if you've got 2 or 3 or 4 other people that you can then have those stories and your experience carried, when you hit a particular hard one, and I know you've hit them, you don't have to just stuff it down.
Yeah.
And the reason I'm encouraging this is I'm sure you've seen it. It's like you look fairly young compared to me. But I know that you've got some old codgers there that you see how jaded they are and how much weight they carry. You can see it in their bodies, the lines in their faces. You can hear it in their words. You can hear it in the tone of their voice, their actions, the things that they're interested in. When you see some guy in his 50s or early 60s that's tired of life, that's a weight that doesn't need to be carried. So I don't know if that helps.
No, absolutely. Thank you so much.
Right. And thank you for your service. And I invite you to get back in touch with me because I've got a couple other guys in Australia that might be interesting for you to meet.
Oh, cool. Will do.
Yeah, do that. So figure out how to get in touch with me. My contact information should be available here.
Yeah, no worries. Thanks, mate.
So definitely reach out.
Cheers, will do.
Ben, is it okay if I put your email in the chat?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. Christian?
First of all, just thank you so much. This was wonderful. And not least because you didn't use any PowerPoints. It was just such a relief to have a pure storytelling. And, there's no props, just your good self, sharing yourself with us. Thank you. Thank you for that.
You're welcome.
I had a time in my life when 2 of my siblings committed suicide. And I got many, many versions of that I can't imagine response, and it just throws you back into your solitude, really. Yeah. So I was comforted by what you said about, people can imagine actually if they choose to do so. And now that you're retired, I guess I wondered what you're doing. I mean, will these stories, will you spend your days telling your stories? Will you write your stories? Is there a way to crystallize all that you've gone through and made, in terms of some packages that you'll leave after you die?
First off, let me say thank you for sharing. I know it's not, it can be a challenge, but yes, we can imagine. And yes, somebody like myself or others, we can bear that weight of those experiences and those stories together, not alone. But as far as my stuff, yes, I've written stories down. I'm in the process of continuing to write and share. And as a storyteller, my primary focus is mythological, fairy tales, that sort of thing. But when I tell them, the ones that touch me are the ones that touch my life experience. And so invariably, if I'm telling a story at one of the men's conferences or one of the other conferences, my experience comes out and it gets shared in the room in the metaphors and the way that the general conversation goes. And so it's the burden doesn't have to be discrete and specific. You can share it metaphorically. Poetry is another way. I didn't talk about poetry. Other kinds of art, put some of your experiences into art of any kind. I like rituals. So one of the things I like to do is build shrines or altars. I spend a lot of time out in nature. I have a clan of ravens that I take cat food out when I go ride my bicycle. And I plant wildflower seeds when I go out into the woods. So there's all these wildflower seeds out there from my experiences. And, these are things I realized real early on in my career, in my life, probably about halfway through being a firefighter, that beauty was always one of the answers. So where I could engage with and create beauty, there was always created room on some level. So however you can create and engage with beauty, then do so. So thank you, Chris.
Thank you so much.
You're very welcome. Erica?
Hi, Ben. Thank you. I was really moved by the humbleness in the way you spoke about your experiences and this work and your thinking about it. So thank you very much. I'm an analyst, and I feel as you were talking, I was thinking about how, analysis is about telling your deepest, scariest, most intense stories, probably for the first time in your life. And I feel, and if I can't be vulnerable, I'm not just there being a professional, but if I can't step into the field of energy and emotion that's in the room, then I'm not very effective. And it's that, and when that does happen and somebody's going to their deepest, darkest place, it's not like I know where we're going. Mm-hmm. I don't know the story. I mean, I've heard plenty of stories, believe me, but for me to follow the breadcrumbs of this person and to watch their mood and their body and their energy is how we find our way to the truth. Mm-hmm. And it's the unburdening of that story that makes the difference, Yeah. So thank you very much.
Very welcome. It occurs to me that Jung had it when he engaged with fairy tales, Freud and Jung both, when they engage with fairy tales, because those draw from the collective experience and images that reside in all of us. Mm-hmm. And so, that's one layer away from the direct lived experience. When I talked about, blood on my hands or the, my fellow firefighter, so gently dealing with the woman who had fallen, and so many others. I don't need to go into some of those. But when you, as an analyst, can engage with that deeper thing that resides between all of us, and you open up that particular door and listen with those ears, mm-hmm. then I'm sure you've had the experience of having that really influence how you do the work that you do.
Mm-hmm. And I also have to find a way to make the transition out of that deep, intense trauma space with that person back into my own personal life,
And that's the task that you chose, and it's a powerful.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like my friend Roger, when he talked about being at war and the tasks of being a soldier and a warrior, and when I thought about my tasks, I mean, that's something that you might take some time and just inquire in yourself, what is the task, soul task, the geisha, if you're familiar with that word, the soul calling that mm-hmm. brings you to the work that you're doing.
Absolutely. It definitely is a soul calling. Thank you.
And I would say that of all of us.
Yeah.
Thank you for doing what you do. Miguel?
Hola. Thank you, Ben. Ben and I have worked together for many years, getting into all kinds of adventures. And thank you for sharing some of these stories I've never heard before, Ben. So it's wonderful to hear you express them in such a beautiful, very poetic way, very dreamy in a way. And this is really for Adam. If you're listening, Adam, one of the things that we work with is we also give our stories, the things that we carry to the earth. So make the earth your friend. Ben was saying, but I want to make sure that if you can't find a human to tell your story to, go tell your story to a tree, to a rock, or to a body of water, or just to the earth itself. Go sit and let the grief or whatever you carry, sorrow, go directly into the earth, because that's where the medicine really is. You know, humans are not good transformers or composters of grief, but the earth is. You know, so eventually, when you get it to the earth, that's really good. That's where the medicine. And put your story in the fire, and the water, or in the earth. You know, tell your story to a tree, and you'd be surprised what happens. But that's sometimes that's good medicine. Thank you.
Thanks, mate. That's great advice. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
And when I connect up with you, we can share a couple more specifics. But one of the things that I like to do also is, if I have the capacity to build a fire, if I don't have, and you know, when I do shrines and that kind of thing, I always include something from the earth, water, fire, and then something living. And so if you have a little space for yourself where you keep a bowl of water, come back, tell what you need to tell, pour that water in the earth. So that's another thing, and make it a gift.
Awesome. Yeah, great. Thank you.
You're welcome. Eric?
I'm not quite sure how to say what I want to say, but I first of all want to thank you. It's a wonderful talk. What caught me was the story that you told of being in the firehouse with the young men and the old men, and telling your story. And I thought about that, that was a powerful thing you did, and a way of showing the young men what a mature man is able to do with his grief. And it occurs to me that when you do the work that you do, either a first responder, a doctor, a soldier, a warrior, there is a requirement to do the work to set emotions aside sometimes. And when anyone goes through an emergency, any sort of trauma, that's part and parcel to survival. But in that, we lose something. We lose touch with something. And it seems to me that grief is the road of return. And young men I know are very frightened of that road. They don't get taught about it. They're not taught that after the emergency, that's the important work that has to be done. We have to grieve. After a trauma, we have to grieve, because that is the road of return. That's where we reclaim ourselves and our souls. Anyway, just that was some thoughts that I had.
Thank you for that, Elric. I think that, you know, one of the things that occurred to me when you were speaking there is that when, I mean, I wasn't particularly old. I was 37, 38 when that happened. You know, it was in the late 90s and so on. But what you said about grief being frightening, what I've recognized, and I alluded to it from a different direction, but when grief and vulnerability arrive, not only is there discomfort with that, but that also triggers. And so, yes, you're absolutely right. When we, you know, and Adam will attest to this, Miguel's had emergency room experience. Some of you others have probably had the same thing. When you get yourself into a dynamic and dangerous situation, your sensitivities that would be normally normally present when you're sitting down and having dinner or watching TV or something, those get suppressed so that you can accomplish what you need to accomplish emotionally, mentally, spiritually, physically. Our capacity, you know, whether or not it's, you know, I'm sure there's lots of brain studies, but our capacities as beings in this world to do astounding and amazing things is just a blink of an eye away. And so, yes, I show up and there's chaos and tragedy and everything right there. It's like I knuckle down and I do what needs to be done. And what you said about grief as one of the pathways back, I think is really, really crucial. Because the task of us as first responders, police, fire, EMS, emergency room doctors, even mental health care professionals and so on, the task is to become resilient. And I like the definition and the synonyms of resilience has to do with flexibility and return. That's the task, is being able to put yourself in the situation, do what needs to be done, attend to the needs as they come, and then come back, make your return back. And that's the practice. That's the practice of being as healthy as we're able in this world, is to embody that flexibility. Grieving processes, rituals, sharing the weight, giving your sadness, your fears, your terrors to the trees, to the earth to carry, is going to be a powerful way of doing that.
Could I say one more thing?
Absolutely.
It just occurs to me also that when we were hunter-gatherers, when we hunted, you see in a lot of early communities among hunters that they go on the hunt and they do the brutal work of killing. But when they came back, they ritualized their relationship with the animal. They honored the animal. They spoke to the animal. They had love for the animal. And so there's a time for everything. And there is a time, as you say, in the moment of an emergency of any sort, where one has to put that vulnerability aside and do what needs to be done. But the missing piece in our culture, I think, and I see it among a lot of young men, they don't realize that there's still work to be done after the emergency is over.
Exactly.
One has to reclaim what you set aside, because if you don't reclaim it, you talked about how something eats at your soul.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't reclaim it, it does that. It throws you out of balance. And grieving is something that it's not just a word, as you know. It's something that you have to do.
Yeah.
And in the doing of it, in the grieving, the actualization, the experience of grieving, it brings you to some peace.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's my experience with it.
So, before we get to you, Christine, I just wanted to answer that a little bit. One of the things that a gift that was given to me by Kyle Nakanalua, he's a Hawaiian warrior tradition, and he gave me the black stone, white stone ritual. And what that is in Maori tradition and Hawaiian warrior cultures is you had the white stone, and it was made from petrified coral. And as he put it, it's like the coral is the progenitor of life. Without coral, no life exists in the ocean, because it's the centerpiece of that. And so a piece of petrified coral would be carried by a person who was in the community, who was part of the community. When warfare or some other, as you put it, bloody affair, as it were, whether it's the hunt or whatever, was called upon, then the person would divest himself of the white stone, and they would take up the black stone. The black stone was made out of black basalt from Pele, the fire goddess that resides at the center of the earth, and they would put that on. And when they did that, that was an ontological shift in being, that they became warrior all the way down to their toenails, did what was necessary in preparation. And then when that work was done, then they would come back and do the rituals of transformation and giving up the black stone, so that they would then take on the white coral, and so that they could then become fully a member of the community all the way down to their toenails. They would share stories. They would have, the rituals that that were secret that I don't have a part to, I can imagine what they might be. So we have to create our own rituals. The other thing that, I wanted to, let's see, no, I lost track of my thought there. Oh, the hunting. I would argue that in a lot of the traditional societies, the rituals of the hunt occurred both before the hunt and after the hunt. And this is one aspect we talk about our culture. We have lost collectively our capacity to have the sacred a living part of our daily life without having it being extrapolated and what do I want to say, projected out onto some building down the street. Every single thing that we do is sacred. And if we just would honor and respect that, then maybe it would influence how we behave in the world. Christine?
I have something I wanted to ask you about, Ben, to speak about. And I also, I don't know if can you see this picture or no?
Not really. Maybe pull it back a little bit. Yeah,
Wait.
there it is. I can see a person.
This is the chief of the fire chief in New Haven, Connecticut. So I thought I can close this circle, and I'm going to write to him, even though it was more than a decade ago. I'm going to write and say thank you. So
He would love that. And
I know.
whether or not he can track down the actual person that did that, the respect and the honor that comes out of those gestures is really profound.
And you taught me that tonight, so I'm grateful for that. The thing I wanted to wonder if you might speak more about is you said you take up this calling knowing that you're putting your life on the line.
Mhm. Absolutely.
And I'm just kind of interested in that, and how, as a young man, what was that like to sign up for that? Was that a conscious part of what you were signing up for, or did that kind of dawn on you as you went along that, oh my gosh, it just seems like that's such a big part of what you and people like you have signed up for, and it's quite different than most of the population.
It was both conscious and unconscious, and there were real revelations and realizations along the way. Just like, just like any young man who, the 18-year-old who joins the Marine Corps. It's like you cannot in this day and age go without knowing that if you become a member of the military, that your life is potentially on the line. Mm-hmm. Same thing with being a police officer or firefighter, even EMS, because who knows what you're exposed to. The kinds of things, like Adam would attest, the kinds of things that we're exposed to when we're out there, not to mention just the mental and emotional and spiritual well-being that we put at stake. As far as my choice, how I made that choice, it came at a time in my life. It was in my early 30s, and I had been in the military. I'd been in some pretty sketchy situations. I was air crew on a Air Force plane. So, we were in the Middle East before the Gulf War. And there were times where things got a little scary. And I think part of this goes back to some sense that it's hardwired into at least some of us to be willing to do what it takes to take care of the people that we call family and community and friends. It gets, kind of abstracted with, nationalism and all the rest of that stuff, flags and whatnot. But ultimately, you've heard that statement that every soldier fights for the guy that's in the foxhole next to him. Heard some version of that. And ultimately, I think what's happened is that on a deep soul level, that's what's being touched in on. Yes, there's the glory, and I made a comfortable living, and it was exciting. The adrenaline rush is unlike anything. I mean, flying down the, pell-mell down a city street in a big old fire engine, and wheeling around corners and doing all the crazy stuff that I did. top of high rises that are on fire, and also knowing that something unfortunate could happen at any time. It's exciting, but there's also something profoundly satisfying knowing that what I'm doing is in service to something greater than myself. So I would say that the answer is that it's unfolding. No young person going into anything remotely resembling this kind of service, whether it's the military, fire, police, EMS, or whatever, no young person beginning that knows what they're really getting into. The other side of that is that that's part of the journey. If their soul calling, if whatever it is that's pulling them in life is taking them down that road, make that journey as sacred as possible. And that's part of our role as older folks in the community.
Thank you, Ben.
You're very welcome. Carolyn, I thought I saw your hand waving around there a moment ago. Are you still here with us?
I just want to, of course, thank you for your service and your vulnerability, your willingness to tell your story, and actually everyone else's questions covered mine.
Okay.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. Anybody else? Anything you want to talk about? Looks like I've exhausted all the questions.
I think I actually want to make a comment. What really struck me in your talk, and I want to thank you very much for sharing. And again, also like others have echoed, thank you for your service. Is the collective that the collective holding the suffering as well. And so, it's not just one person necessarily, but also that you lean upon, but also others, and the importance of really weaving community together through people being able to hold other humans suffering, when they share the story, and how important that is, and what a shift in consciousness that is too for communities to start being able to show up, not just your best friend or even your analyst or therapist, but different people, and how we can do that for each other and the potency of that. Thank you so much for really the way you articulated that as a strategy for healing, for all of us healing, to be able to share, but then also to hear deeply and to witness.
So, you bring up something really important there, Judith. I appreciate that. The first is that people often wonder how it is that I can do what I can do when it comes time to these things. And I noticed something really early on, and Adam, you can tell me if you had the same experience, that when I showed up to a traffic accident, let's say, and there's all this chaos, there's broken bones, there's bodies all over the place and everything else, and there's a lot of people. Whenever these events happen, a lot of people would show up. And when that happened, I always jumped in, the old phrase is assholes and elbows. All they'd see is my butt and my back, and I'd be in there working. Adam's laughing over here because he knows exactly what's going on. And so when I was in that particular role, it didn't matter how crazy and devastating things were. I knew what I was about. I knew who I was in the circumstance, and I knew what to do. If, however, we were third in, fourth in, we arrived at the scene late, and the action was all being taken care of by the crews that had arrived before us, and I was an observer, it was a completely different experience. Watching the tragedy versus participating in helping the tragedy was two vastly different things. And so this is one of the things that I would caution us as mature listeners, hearers, is that we need to be responsible in both what we ask and how we take in somebody else's story. I know that I've heard stories of somebody unconsciously asking somebody from a veteran from a war, saying, well, gee, did you ever kill anybody? You know, it's like that's an irresponsible question to ask, right? So it's important to be responsible around that. Yeah, I'll just leave it at that. Christine, you had a question?
You're someone that's obviously done a lot of work on yourself and availed yourself of special, I don't know, healing communities, that kind of thing. What I'm curious about as you talk about your team, the guys that you work with every day, what was that like in terms of being able to engage in this process that you're describing? Do you understand what I'm asking?
Yes, I do.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I found out is that there's the culture in fire stations, especially, and I'm sure it's the same in police stations and other places, is that there's a lot of machismo. You know, we're all tough guys. We're all here. We all know what the heck we're doing. You know, we all have that. Me too. It's like I'm a penultimate tough guy as well. It's like put an axe in my hand or a chainsaw and I'll go wreak havoc wherever it's like I'm pretty good at all that stuff. But for me, because I was a little bit on the eccentric side, a little bit on the uncommon side as far as that goes, certainly not. There were other guys that had a pretty profound level of openness. I found that when I was able to be relaxed in my own skin and allow space, the guys would come up to me one-on-one, tell me things that they would never share in a larger group. And I remember, one of a lieutenant. So, a lieutenant runs the shift in the fire engine. He's the guy that's in charge. And a lieutenant from a different station showed up at the house. And I was there. It was shift change. So he was leaving and I was coming. And he walked in, saw that I was by myself, walked over, took me aside and sat down and shared with me how concerned he was for his crew because they had been on a multiple drowning. 2 kids had drowned in a local lake, and his crew were the ones that had pulled the bodies out. And normally we would have a response, a critical incident response, to talk to the guys, do the debriefings and all that kind of stuff. And it didn't happen, slipped through the cracks. What I could see was that this man was just as shook up as any of the other crew members might be. However, because he was there ostensibly for his crew, I was able to just sit down and listen, hear what he had to say, and then agree with him on a plan to get the guys in so that we could have a conversation and just kind of help share what had occurred. So yes, it's being somebody that wants to be more open. It really came down to allowing more than it did going in and poking at people. So if you allow the space, it's pretty funny. If you are with somebody, something's up and you allow the space for them to step into that, things happen. The other thing you can do is to create a ritual space or a sacred space. And this is something that Miguel alluded to. Take somebody for a walk, get them out into the woods, get in nature. Be able to, if somebody needs some space and time, it's like, hey, there's a nice log, have a sit. I'll be back in 10 minutes. It's pretty amazing what can be healed if we allow space for it.
That gives me a picture of what it was looking like on the ground, So thank you for addressing that.
Yeah, it's Miguel and I noticed working with vets that we'd have these great programs and we'd do this and we'd do that. And the 2 things that I think I saw the most movement, 3 things were the most movement with people were, number 1, when I turned guys loose to build altars, go build a shrine to beauty, go build a shrine to grief. And these guys would be like, and then all of a sudden it's like, it's up to you. You do whatever you want. And pretty soon guys are out there doing just amazing things, incredible beauty. The other thing where we did Sweat Lodge, And it was amazing what people would do when they come together for a ceremony. And the third thing, and probably the most profound thing, is what happened around the meal table, especially in the middle of the night. So all the programs that we did were great, but the real work was done with guys sitting together drinking coffee. Miguel?
That's exactly what I was going to say. Especially, we learned that in Maui, we would psychologize and analyze everything to death, and we were not getting anywhere. And one of the elders, Francis Sinensi, invited us to start building things with him. So when we started building, working with our hands, and talk story all of a sudden started happening out there, crawling. Then there's a way of creating a distraction. So cooking meals, like many times we'd be in the kitchen at 2 a.m, and that's when all the stories would come out. What happened, or up on the roof tying palms, or our knees deep in mud planting taro, weeding taro fields, but you realize there's a metabolical function that the earth, so you need a distractor of some kind, what they call in quantum physics a special attractor, right? And so the making a meal together, creating ritual, creating beauty, you need a something that will allow you to get you need a distractor. The mind needs to be engaged in some form so that the heart can actually begin to speak. And this is what you're looking at, what the device, cooking food, inviting somebody for a meal. We go do a garden, go plant a garden somewhere, things like that, where you can actually, and then that's where you create the opening for this community to begin to happen. So that's, anyway, but I'm glad you got to that, because that's what I was thinking. Yeah. Hands, get the hands involved, distract the mind, so the heart can speak. Anyway.
It just occurred to me, intact does not mean that there aren't cracks in the wall. So, anybody else? I think we're getting close to the end of our time together. Anybody has anything to offer?
I'll say one more thing too. When these are very intimate, special times, and you have to think of it as there's an opening and a closure when these intimate spaces get opened up. So you have to realize that a closure has to be done. Like Ben, we know this. This is ritual, practical information for us. I've been running sweats for 43 years, so it's really critical to open it up and then close it up properly. So when you have somebody tell a story of this caliber, of this nature, you have to realize you have to titrate yourself down also to return to normal, but the soul business is done. So you have to now, okay, we're done with this. So you have to create a demarcation of the zone, like walking into the therapist's office and leaving, creating a threshold. Now this time is now done. This is really important too, especially with nature, when the subject matter is as deep and as powerful as an emotional or traumatic experience is. So anyway.
Thank you. That's really good. So I've got a poem to read, speaking of which, unless somebody else has something to offer. Sorry, I'm going to shed a little bit of light on the subject, because that's one of the afflictions that I have, is going blind in my old age. And this is by T.S. Eliot. Something I have said before, I shall say it again. Shall I say it again? In order to arrive there, to arrive where you are, to get from where you are not, you must go by a way wherein there is no ecstasy. In order to arrive at what you do not know, you must go by a way which is the way of ignorance. In order to possess what you do not possess, you must go by the way of dispossession. In order to arrive at what you are not, you must go through the way in which you are not. And what you do not know is the only thing you know, and what you own is what you do not own, and where you are is where you are not. I have no idea what that means, other than recognizing that when we rush into unknown spaces, it's the unknowing that opens the door for the direction that we're going to go. Okay. Anybody else, or before we go?
It's a beautiful way to end our time together, Ben. Oh, there's Paula has her hand up.
Paula?
Hello, everyone. I was just thinking as I heard many of the questions that got the answers for my own also, is that through it all, I could hear trust as a word, as a feeling, as a need happening there. And in your poem, I hear like the same thing. How do I go towards the unknown if I don't trust that there's something there that I don't know that I might find? How do I trust to share my story with someone if I don't know how it's going to be taken care of? But I'm offering my trust with my story, trusting that it will be appreciated in a sacred way. How do I offer a question to someone to see what's happening to them in this life that they are leading, facing fear or whatever life is bringing in such intense way, if I don't trust that my question is going to be accepted and it's going to be allowed to happen and maybe answered. And I was thinking how to get through fear, we need trust. We need to trust the community. We need to trust ourselves to talk. We need to trust ourselves to ask the question. And it was very beautiful. Thank you so much, Ben, for sharing your stories. And in everyone sharing the stories, I could listen a lot of trust happening and how trust is what keeps us together and helps us to weave the web that finally creates resilience as a community.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's beautiful. I think what you just said is something really, really crucial, and that's that what I realize is very often we have a practice of putting trust out there with expectation. And one of the things that the T.S. Eliot poem says is put trust out there, but without the expectation, which is it's a more mature approach, I think. Okay. I will say this, you have, write down my email. Please reach out to me if you have any questions or you want to carry on a dialogue. I'll do my best to get back quickly. Sometimes I'm a bit distracted, but I'm here. And I want to say thank you very much for hearing my stories, for engaging in this larger conversation, and for being willing to put yourselves into this circle. The image that I sent off for the website, I was at that fire, watching my guys at the top of that aerial ladder squirting water down into a building that's burning right below them. And it occurred to me, it's like, that's what we do. But what you don't see in that picture are the dozens of men and women underneath him, making sure that he's there, able to do his job. We don't do it alone. And if we get ourselves caught in the situation where we're either forced or encouraged or through whatever the circumstances that we are alone, we're not as strong as we need to be. So thank you.
You've left us with many gifts this evening, Ben. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Ben.
Thank you so much. It was wonderful.
Thank you, Ben.
Thank you, Ben.
Thank you, Ben.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ben.
And Ben, from one veteran to another, thank you.
Very welcome. Thank you, Charlie.
Thanks, mate.